I've got to say, it's not often that I'm disappointed by a pantheon, but the Romans just barely pulled it off. And this is coming from someone who loves their mythology. But today, we're talking about Roman mythology. So let's get started. The Romans didn't invent polytheism, belief in multiple gods, nor did they invent the concept of anthropomorphic deities with human emotions and concerns. In fact, their entire system was heavily borrowed and adapted from the Greeks. The Romans were also pragmatic people. Their religion was practical and useful. They weren't concerned with the why or how things happened, just so long as it worked and provided a means to order the world around them, they were satisfied. This is probably what made their religion so successful in being adopted and adapted by other cultures. It wasn't bound to any one ethnicity or people. Most Roman myths have no definitive written source. They were passed down orally for generations before being recorded, and since the Romans didn't really care about the stories, most of what we know comes from Greek writers like Ovid, Hyginus, and Plutarch, as well as a few scattered sources from Roman writers like Livy and Dionysius. Much of what we know about their religion comes from these sources. And there are some interesting things to note. First of all, they didn't have a creation myth. None of the classical Roman writers bothered to record how the world began or where the universe came from. They just kind of assumed that the world had always existed. Now, this may seem weird to us because most religions do have a creation story, but it wasn't that important to the Romans. It's likely that they got this idea from the Greeks because they certainly borrowed the rest of their mythology from them. The Romans had two main founding myths. The first was the legendary story of Romulus and Remus. According to this myth, the city of Rome was founded in the year 1153 BC by Romulus, who killed his twin brother Remus after the two of them disagreed over the location of the new city. This myth was extremely important to the Romans because it gave them a legendary origin point. It was used to justify their expansion into Italy and their dominance over the Italian peninsula. This myth also established the idea that Rome was a new city, even though it was actually quite old when it was founded. By giving themselves a legendary past, the Romans could feel as if they were destined to be great. They were the chosen people. The second founding myth was a more historical account by Livy. He tells the story of how Rome was built on the banks of the Tiber River by refugees from the city of Alba Longa. This account makes it clear that Rome was just another city in Italy, nothing special. So why did the Romans accept both of these stories? Well, it's simple. They believed both of them. To the Romans, their destiny was written in the stars. So when they learned that the constellation of Gemini represented their founders, they believed it. Now, aside from those two stories, the Romans didn't really have any other myths to call their own. Everything else they took from the Greeks. But they didn't just copy the Greeks. They adapted their myths to fit their own culture and beliefs. For example, in Greek mythology, Zeus was the supreme god of the sky and the leader of the cosmos. But in Roman mythology, he became Jupiter, the king of the gods and the ruler of Mount Olympus. The Romans didn't change much about him. They just gave him a new name. The same thing happened to Hades, who became Pluto, the god of the underworld. Then there was Poseidon, who became Neptune, the god of the sea, and so on and so forth. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't bad. The Romans added a lot of interesting details to their version of Greek myths. For example, in the story of Cupid and Psyche, the Romans introduced a character named Despoina, who was the personification of bad behavior. She's an interesting character who adds a lot to the story. But this isn't true for all of their myths. I mean, what was the point of changing Persephone's name to Proserpina? That change made no sense at all. Aside from simply renaming the Greek gods, the Romans also adapted many of the myths to make them more palatable to their audience. For example, in Greek mythology, the goddess Athena was born from Zeus's head. But in Roman mythology, she was born from Jupiter's brain. See, the Greeks viewed Athena as the goddess of wisdom, but the Romans viewed her as the goddess of war, so they changed the story to reflect that. Another interesting thing to note about Roman mythology is that it was heavily intertwined with their religion. Every Roman god had a corresponding cult and temple, and the Romans believed that each god had a specific set of duties that he or she was responsible for. This is unlike the Greeks, who saw their gods as more abstract and less bound to specific tasks. Another interesting thing about Roman mythology is that it was very tolerant of foreign gods. The Romans were quick to adopt foreign deities into their pantheon, sometimes with little or no alteration. For example, the Celtic goddess of fertility, Brigid, became the Roman goddess of healing, Minerva, and the Egyptian goddess Isis became the Roman goddess of magic, Isis. This tolerance was likely due to the Romans' pragmatic approach to religion. As long as a god was effective, they didn't care where he or she came from. This brings us to the next interesting thing about Roman mythology, which is that it was heavily influenced by astrology. The Romans believed that the positions of the stars and planets could influence human affairs, and they saw many of the constellations as representing important figures from their mythology. For example, they believed that the constellation of Gemini represented the twin gods Romulus and Remus. This belief led to the Romans adapting many of their myths to fit the patterns in the sky. It also led to the creation of several new myths that weren't based on anything Greek. One of the most famous examples of this is the myth of the Argonauts. The Argonauts were a group of heroes who went on a quest to find the Golden Fleece. Their journey took them all over the known world, and they encountered all sorts of monsters and mythical creatures. This myth was likely created by the Romans to explain the constellation of the Big Dipper. You see, the Romans believed that the Big Dipper represented the ship that the Argonauts sailed in. But that's just a theory. So now we come to my disappointment. Roman mythology is pretty good. It has all the best parts of Greek mythology without the annoying parts. It's easy to understand, and the characters are all very relatable. But the problem with Roman mythology is that there isn't enough of it. Most of the myths are just retellings of Greek myths with a few minor changes, and the Romans didn't have any creation stories or any other myths that were truly their own. I mean, sure, they had a couple of interesting stories, but that's it. If you want to learn more about Roman mythology, I suggest you start with Greek mythology. Learn about all the myths and stories that the Romans took from the Greeks, then read up on the few myths that the Romans created on their own. Then finally, read up on the Roman religion and how their beliefs and practices differed from those of the Greeks. And if you want to learn more about other mythologies, be sure to check out our series, where we cover Norse, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and other mythologies. And finally, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and check out my channel for more.